give a very brief introduction about our guest speaker, Sanja. She works as a AP leader for Canfor. She is a certified change management practitioner, and she has first-hand experience in leading teams through the transformational change. She is very passionate about people, and she really loves reading books. Welcome again, Sanja. So I would like to hand over the presentation to you.
Perfect. Okay, excited to be here and talk about change management, more of kind of a broad look at change management. But let's dive in here and hopefully you find the presentation useful today. So the way that I've structured the presentation today is really in three parts. So initially, we will define change management and give kind of a structured meaning to it, and also answer the question of why do we care about change management? And then following that, we'll move into talking about some of the challenges that we frequently face when it comes to big transformational projects, be it that they're technology-led or not. And then lastly, we will talk about opportunities. What are some of the kind of best practices? What are some of the things that you can walk away with that really just increase your chance of success when it comes to implementing changes in your organization? So change management. Before we define change management, I feel like it's good to mention that COVID has obviously had amplified the need for change across organizations, specifically adoption of technology, more digital, fewer paper processes, and so on and so forth. But as a result, I think the exposure to the practice of change management has certainly been more frequent for a lot of folks. So in terms of this group, not sure where you are in your change management adoption or usage within your organization. Some of you may have change practitioners working within your organization, and some of you may just be starting out on your path of understanding change management and how it relates to you. And I think regardless of where you are along your path, I welcome you today and hope you find what we go through useful. But I think as a starting point, we should define change management. So change management is really, it's a systematic approach employed by organizations. So it's a process we use to increase the successful likelihood of adoption of change, be it cultural, structural, or technological change. When it comes to change, we often get asked, why do we need to change? If it's not broken, do we really need to fix it? How relevant is change management to me and to my organization if we don't have any imminent plans to change? And the reality of operating in business today is that there are lots of external factors forcing us to change, things like market conditions, customer demands, of course, disruptive technology, things like inputs and costs, such as fuel, for example, and then, of course, competition among some of the common ones. And then, of course, most recently, one we've all been impacted by, which is COVID. There are other factors to consider, of course, as well, which could be internal. So these could be things like an internal desire to change within our organization. Maybe we want to improve our performance or the quality of our products, or maybe the satisfaction from our customers, or equally, it could be leadership changes that result in a change in vision or mission. So lots of different factors that could impact a need to change within our organization. I'm going to throw up this quote here. The price of doing the same old thing is far higher than the price of change. And I find it really useful to illustrate this. So in 2017, McKinsey and Company published this finding: the life expectancy of an S&P 500 company in 1935 was approximately 90 years. And fast forward to 2016, we see the same life expectancy for the same type of company on the S&P to 18 years. So obviously drastic change in life expectancy of companies today, and McKinsey and Company quoting fundamental forces like technological revolutions, urbanization, and aging populations among some of the factors impacting longevity for companies. Let's take a moment to relate this to our experience of the last 2 years. So my favorite example to quote is working remotely. So if we imagine an environment where working from home or working remotely was very reluctantly accepted, and there was a real sense of eagerness to return to, quote, the old normal as soon as possible, in order to go back to how we were pre-COVID conditions. Would this company push for progressive adoption of digital tools and technology? In all likelihood, no. In a lot of ways, adoption of digital tools was really just the bare minimum for most companies to continue to operate in this space. So what we can deduce about life expectancy as it pertains to organizations that refuse to adopt or refuse to change, especially in light of environmental factors, is that a company that's not particularly agile or has difficulty changing is just undoubtedly going to have a more difficult time continuing to operate for a long period of time. And that a more agile organization is just going to be more flexible and more likely to be successful in adapting to all the different types of changes that we named earlier. So I'm going to put a statement out here: change is good. And you probably, some of you may not resonate with that statement, but I'm going to see if I can turn you around kind of by the end of the presentation. So change can only be positive. Change can only be positive. Let's let that sit for a moment. So change of heart, change of pace, to change one's mind, to change one's tune, to change the course. These are very common phrases that we use day in, day out, but what do they have in common? So change at its heart is in fact progressive. It suggests some kind of movement. In the moment when we are forced to change, or when we're faced with change, it's very difficult to see change as progressive. We find that in the long term, looking at 50, 60, 100 years, in fact, we see that change is evolutionary. But certainly in the moment, we find that change is hard. I want to illustrate this idea that change is hard with an example that I think is very relatable to most. So the example starts with, starting tomorrow, I will do something. I will do something that I haven't done before. I've made a plan. So starting tomorrow, I'm going to spend less time on my phone. I'm going to not check my email after work. Maybe I'm going to exercise daily. Starting tomorrow, I'm going to eat better, drink more water, read more, and so on and so forth. It may not be one of these thoughts, but if you've had a starting tomorrow thought, you've probably had that thought hundreds, if not thousands of times. So were you successful? Were you successful in delivering the change that you set out to? If you're thinking no, don't worry, you're certainly not alone. In fact, when it comes to our personal lives, the overwhelming majority, about 80% of us, will fail in making personal change in our lives within 1 month of starting. So let's unpack that. When humans think about change, we conceptually imagine a light switch, like we can turn it on and we can turn it off. It shouldn't be so hard. If we're clear in our intentions, if we know what needs to happen, we know exactly what actions we need to take to make it happen, then it's just a matter of like hitting the light switch and starting tomorrow. And of course, as you already know from your own experience, that's not the case. In fact, change, but especially organizational change, is actually more complex. In fact, it's so complex that shockingly, 70% of large-scale change initiatives, so this is Deloitte 2016, 70% of large-scale change initiatives fail to meet their long-term goals. If you're sitting there thinking that this is an incredibly high failure rate for a large-scale multi-million-dollar project, you are absolutely right, it is. And so to understand how we improve our chances of these odds being stacked against us, we will now unpack some of the challenges that we face that contribute to failure in transformational change. So some of the challenges, so obviously with that kind of statistic, lots of pitfalls in terms of how we proceed to make change and how we are unsuccessful in that change. So here's some of my favorites. And when I say favorites, I mean some of the ones that really get quoted fairly frequently in terms of why transformational change fails. So we'll kind of go through these one by one. So the first one here, vision, strategy, targets being poorly communicated. So this is simply, we don't understand the vision. This is our why. Why are we changing? We don't understand the strategy, the how of the change, and we're really not sure how we're going to be measured when all is said and done. So having a poorly communicated vision, strategy, targets makes it immensely difficult for people to engage or know if they're being successful in the change. Urgency not being communicated. This is really key. So when earlier in the presentation, we talked about the quote that I put up there, and we talked about the longevity of companies. So there are lots of external factors causing an urgency for us to change. COVID is a really good example of an urgency situation where we had to change. But there's also an internally driven things like quality that cause an urgency to change for organizations. And so how do we communicate the urgency and make it something that people need to act on immediately rather than something that we put on the back burner? And so failure to create an urgency, to communicate an urgency around change means that the change is interpreted as something that's okay, but something we're going to put on the back burner and not deal with immediately. The messaging around the change is unclear. So different folks communicating the message across the organization, or different messaging altogether, different interpretations, there's a natural aversion to the confusion that occurs. And so folks, of course, go back to what they've always known, and they continue to operate how they did before the change until they're forced otherwise. And then lastly, in terms of communication, information vacuums persist. So this is a situation where we're in the dark, there's lots of uncertainty, nobody really feels like they know what's going on. And so as a result, we largely ignore the change, and we find that we'll get along without adopting to it for the time being. Culture is not addressed. So another key reason why change fails is culture not being addressed. So culture is generally ignored. It's considered soft. It's intangible, and as a result, it gets sidelined. So we sort of just say we're not going to worry about culture. We'll figure that out. If the change is dictated, so change being dictated is very key in terms of our success, because we don't want to dictate change. We want to engage people in the change. And so if we simply communicate the change, if we mandate the change, but we don't make it a hands-on process, we don't engage people in the process of change, then there's a lot of folks who will be asking, why wasn't I asked? Why did no one inform me, involve me? And that makes it, again, difficult to get the right engagement rates in the change. And then lastly, change fatigue sets in. So this would be just an overwhelming amount of change all occurring at once, and pulling people in lots of directions. So naturally leading to exhaustion, demotivation, not retaining people, and so on and so forth. So these are some of the reasons that change fails. So interestingly, the first four on this list actually speak to communication. And we're going to address some strategies around the first four in the third part of our presentation when we talk about opportunity. But the last three, we're kind of going to deep dive into them a little bit more before we move on to part three of the presentation. So the last three are really all about action. There's a lot of these summaries in terms of barriers to change, barriers to digital transformation, and things that impact how successful our projects are. There's a lot of lists out there. I quite like this one because it works backwards. So this is Net Solutions, 5 barriers to digital transformation. And so working backwards, number 5 is agility. Agility being our ability to move quickly and adapt and be nimble. So obviously very key to any kind of change efforts that we're trying to make. Digital security being something also very high on the list. So especially relevant in the post-COVID state or during COVID, where companies are maybe trying to move to more of an online presence. They're trying to get away from paper. They're trying to move into a digital space. So how do we protect our data, our identity, our other assets in that digital space? And so digital security becomes a really key piece of that of digital transformation. So one of the key barriers to it. Number three, from working backwards, lack of budget clarity. So I think self-explanatory. And then number two, lack or poor management of IT resources. So absolutely all those amazing business analysts out there doing the heavy lifting, but not enough people or people that are poorly managed, and it quickly shows on projects. So number one, I think always a surprise. So number one reason, number one barrier to kind of digital transformation projects, organizational culture. So here's that stat again that we saw earlier. So 70% of digital transformations fail, most often due to resistance from employees. And for those who are statistically inclined, most in the report is defined as 70%. So 70% of digital transformations fail, and 70% of the time due to resistance from employees. So let's unpack culture for a moment here. Culture. So McKinsey and Company have a fantastic definition of culture here. Culture is how things get done around here. It's how we do things here. And so culture is really, it's the values, it's the beliefs, it's our practices, it's kind of all the things that we do day to day that make us who we are. Culture is built through modeling. And there was a study done by PricewaterhouseCoopers in 2002, where they talk about culture in the context of change. And they're quoted as saying that as an enabler of change, culture remains stubbornly under-leveraged. And it's really for all the reasons that we touched on earlier. It's soft, it's intangible, it's just difficult to wrap our heads around it and move it forward. The unfortunate thing is that to reap the benefits of digital transformation, we really need to take a culture first approach to our business transformation. And I want to pause here and kind of reframe what we're saying there. So if culture is how we do things around here, and things around here are about to change because of some transformation that we're undertaking, then it goes to say that if we fail to address culture, we fail to address change. So put differently, our change management efforts will be unsuccessful if we don't address culture. Moving on and kind of speaking to engagement and communication. So when it comes to change management, companies tend to take a very rational approach to what they call engagement. So typically it's a series of communication materials, and ultimately we communicate the change, we dictate what we believe needs to be done as part of the change, and we just expect the action will follow. And unfortunately, communication is not engagement. So if you recall the exercise that we did earlier, where I asked you to think about a time when you kind of decided that you were going to make a change for yourself, you were going to change a habit. You dictated it to yourself. You likely knew what you needed to do. You knew when you needed to do it. All of these factors were very clear. So you'd communicated the items and the timelines and the tasks very clearly to yourself. But just because we're rational, or we do a good job of communicating, or we even dictate the change, doesn't mean that we're going to get the engagement required to make the change successful. In fact, we know from the research that's been done that success is heavily reliant on engagement and buy-in, and that simply dictating or communicating the change is unsuccessful and slow. And then the third part of the action items of, when change is unsuccessful is change fatigue. So what is change fatigue? So change fatigue is essentially many competing initiatives, many competing objectives. If you think about COVID and in the last couple of years, what's been going on with people, people have been subjected to immense amounts of change at one time. Everything from remote work to new technologies to, changes in business models, potentially restructuring as a result of those other three things, regulatory restrictions, cultural initiatives, digitalization everywhere. So all of these things happening at once can be immensely overwhelming for people in that space, people who are impacted by the change. So change fatigue leading to some of the unfortunate things listed there. So we get less productive workers, there's more time off, higher attrition. Of course, morale erodes when we're feeling incredibly stretched, and the business ultimately suffers. So moving on from the kind of negatives and the challenges with change, let's move into the exciting things. So the opportunities. So earlier I talked about the 4 points on that slide, and I said these 4, they're all kind of related to communication. And so what we'll do now is we'll unpack some of those, and we'll talk about what are some of the successes and some of the things that we can do to make ourselves more successful when we undertake change. So with respect to the first one, vision, strategy, and targets. So vision first. So McKinsey and Company tells us that if you get this part wrong, so if you do a poor job of communicating vision, strategy, and targets, you only have a 12% chance of being successful in the transformational change. So this means that communicating the change and communicating that vision becomes really paramount. So a vision defined here serves as a bridge. So it's a link between where we are and where we want to be post-change. And it's really answering that question of why are we changing? The why speaks to motivation. And so in communicating our vision and communicating the why, we're also going to touch on either intrinsic or extrinsic motivators for people impacted by the change. So intrinsic, of course, being things like meaning and mastery and curiosity. And then extrinsic being rewards, like it could be money, could be simply being number one. Different humans, of course, are wired differently. And so where one person could be motivated by being number one, another person may be motivated by mastering a particular topic. And a well-communicated vision executed by leadership should really inspire, excite, resonate with everyone. Perhaps not everyone like 100%, but certainly with most people walking away, being able to relate to the why of that vision. The second part of that 12%, the strategy. So this one really simply, if the vision takes us from A to B, how do we get there? How do we move between A and B? What are the different steps we need to take in order to achieve our vision? And then, of course, targets. So targets, it seems like such an obvious thing to define your targets at the outset, but unfortunately frequently forgotten, or something that we kind of try to figure out as we're progressing through our change, which becomes even more complex. Defining our targets at the outset is really beneficial. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but not only does it allow us to know where we're ultimately heading and to measure against that statistic for the future, but it also helps us to see how we're progressing and helps us celebrate those small progresses along the way in our journey of transformation. So moving away from vision and strategy and targets and on to the consistent messaging, which was point 2 that we struggle with when it comes to change. So messaging around change really needs to be consistent across different groups, across different seniority across the organization, whether it's senior managers or middle managers or frontline folks. Everybody needs to be getting the same messaging in terms of the change. And ultimately, we want each human walking away thinking, I know what I need to do with respect to this change. I understand my part in this change. Otherwise, again, confusion, aversion, and we go back to the way we've always done things. Point 3, in terms of the things we're trying to overcome, in terms of the challenges of project and communication, sense of urgency. So we talked about this at the very beginning. This is a quote here from Jack Welch. And he says, if the rate of change on the outside exceeds the rate of change on the inside, then the end is near. And, linking that to the statistic that we saw earlier on longevity of organizations today. the thing is, organizations are actually very good at adapting to urgency. If, for example, we see a system failure, we likely have processes in place to deal with that. We know exactly what we need to do, who we need to contact, who needs to get involved to resolve it. If you're in an operations environment, very much the same. We know which hands need to get on deck so that we can resolve the situation. Day to day, our sense of urgency it changes, and there is less of a sense of urgency in what we do. So really critical to motivating people to change, especially at the rate that you require. So in terms of the ROI of your project, in terms of the length of your project and everything you want to achieve, it's really important that that urgency is clearly communicated and that folks do feel like they really need to be working through the different aspects of the change at a rapid pace. And we'll touch on this later as well, but it actually positively influences change fatigue. So it works against change fatigue to have a good sense of urgency in terms of tasks relating to the change. And then the last piece on communicating the change, so information vacuum. So when it comes to change, especially large scale transformational change, a lack of communication or just a general lack of transparency can be really troublesome. There's a concept in neuroscience called apophenia, which is defined as finding meaning or patterns where none exist. And what this means is that when human beings are presented with a lack of information, so when we feel like we're in the dark, when there's lots of uncertainty, especially in the context of big transformational change, the apophenia starts to set in, and we start to construct our own stories and generally start to make assumptions around the change, typically for the worse, which can obviously derail our change efforts. So to minimize uncertainty in times of change and prevent information vacuums, formal leaders need to lead with transparency. There needs to be they need to do their best to communicate what they know and what they learn with others in the organization, and to be honest when we can't be transparent in light of the change. So moving away from the communication piece and into culture. So obviously we touched on culture, and we said in the earlier part of the presentation that if culture is how we do things around here and we're about to change how we do things, then of course we have to address culture to address the change. So let's talk about some of the things we can do to make the change stick. And if you take away one part of today's presentation, let it be the importance of role modeling. So culture, like we said, it's created through behavior. It's consistent behavior. Although companies try, it's not something that we can publish in a memo or put in a policy. If we determine that tomorrow we want to be a culture of learning or a culture of innovation, we can't just put that out there and make it so. That's not how it works. Culture is built over time, and it is built through modeling. And as we progress in our project, we need to understand that the relevant behavior has to change to support the culture. And so there's a really a link there between the two. I want you to know what culture in action looks like. So I picked a couple examples here. Culture in action. So if you went to your organization tomorrow and you looked around, culture in action would be how a CEO responds in a crisis. So something's happened and you look at the CEO, how is he responding? That's culture, because we're going to model our behaviors from that. It's how we treat our customers. What's the norm? It's how we treat our vendors. Again, what's the norm in your organization? It's how we criticize. It's how we praise. And it could be things as small as our behavioral norms in the office, in meetings, in team activities. All those kinds of things are culture at work. How do new folks who enter into the organization, how do they adapt to the culture when they join? They do so by watching and really repeating what's being modeled by others. So essentially they're attempting to fit in. So according to research done by McKinsey and Company, as well as Deloitte, as well as the ProSci Institute, role modeling is the single most important factor in influencing successful change. See, that ultimately culture starts at the top, and if the folks at the top don't quite look like they are buying into the change, it makes it really difficult for others in the organization too. The kind of interesting thing about culture is that although it starts at the top, it does get kind of reinforced at all the different levels in the organization. So as an example, if your boss or your colleague is dismissive of the change, then there's an increased likelihood that you also will be dismissive of the change purely through following those cultural norms. So this, of course, means that role modeling, whether it's very senior leadership or leadership throughout the organization, is critically important. And so when we talk about leadership, again, whether it's executives, whether it's project leadership or informal leadership in the organization, what do we need to be successful? What are some of the things we should look for? So a leader who is passionate about their vision or the vision or project. So someone who has a passion and an excitement for the change. We want someone who is visible and active. So someone who's experienced, who understands their role in the project, who understands change management, maybe someone who's politically savvy and can leverage relationships across the organization to get buy-in, to get other counterparts in the organization progressing with the change also. And then, of course, it helps to be a good communicator. So we can actually use our existing culture to, we can leverage our existing culture. And there's a great quote here: the culture you have can evolve into the culture you need. So at the beginning of our project, we would do kind of an exercise to assess our current culture. And we would say, what are some things that we do really well? What are some strengths in our culture? And then more so, how can we leverage some of the things that we do really well to accomplish some of those really critical changes that we need? Ultimately, it takes small changes which compound over time to change a culture. So liking this to our personal experiments, it would be where going forward, I eat one healthy meal, I eat healthy at every meal, and therefore in a year I'm healthier. So we can change our culture over time to become the culture that we need, but it takes time. And so in the meantime, how do we leverage the skills and kind of the great things in our current culture to become the culture that we need in the future? So moving on to engagement. So I'd mentioned this earlier in terms of how critical engagement is, and we'll get into the details of that. But I love this. Organizations don't change, people do. So change doesn't happen to companies. I think this is probably the first thing I share with people when we go into projects, is that change doesn't happen to companies. It happens to individuals. People change, companies don't change, individuals do. And so when we think about change and we think about engagement, we have to think about all the people who have to flip from past to future to become the change, to become successful. And sometimes it's just simply easier to look at the statistics and say, this project affects 7,000 people. We can't possibly address every single one of the 7,000 people. And therefore, we just need to change as an organization. And realistically, on that note, we can engage 7,000 people, but we do that in layers through good leadership. So let's talk about engagement. Some of the kind of really key things on how do we get people engaged in the change. So one, getting people involved in decision-making from the very beginning. So we treat our employees as participants in the change rather than targets of the change. We involve people in the interpretation and the shaping of that change. Number two, we hire internally for the right leaders. So we need to recognize that major scale change is a very big opportunity to build leaders in our organization. And so we want to choose carefully, and remembering role modeling that we mentioned earlier, and just pick the right leaders maybe formal leaders, but perhaps informal leaders who are passionate and who can be the forefront of that change and would engage in the change. Number 3, unleash the power in formal leaders. Yeah, so really key. So I think when we think about leadership, naturally folks think of managers, directors, VPs, and in fact, some of the folks who can have the most powerful impact on our changes are informal leaders in the organization. So these are people who are trusted, people who motivate others, people who inspire others, they instill pride in their work in the organization. These people are can be incredibly powerful for progressing the change and getting high rates of engagement. Number 4, create events to energize and kickstart the change. So one of the things that we know through readings is that events create kind of a shared history with respect to the change. So having a kickstart event, or some type of kind of origin story, a beginning, it acts like an anchor to the change. It acts as a cultural shift for the change. And then further down the line, as we talk about moving through the change and change fatigue, we can actually have leaders use these events and storytelling to re-engage people in the change. So events can be really powerful. And then last but not least, be prepared to make difficult people decisions. So I always think this is like the last resort in terms of what you want to do as a leader, but ultimately sometimes we may have to remove people along the way for the benefit of the change if we find that one person is making a fairly negative and substantial impact on us progressing the change forward. So just something to be aware of there. And then last but not least, in terms of our opportunities, is around change fatigue. So like we talked about earlier, there are a lot of things that folks have recently been had to contend with, a lot of change happening a very short period of time. And so what are some of the things we can do to minimize change fatigue or to improve our chances of getting change fatigue? So first is focusing on a few critical changes. So pick the changes that will set the foundation for your large scale change. So and then from there, actively manage resources to avoid burnout. That's probably number 1 in terms of what you can do to prevent or manage change fatigue. Keep reaffirming the urgency and the need for change. So again, we touched on this earlier, but having an urgency, it just it kind of forces us forward in terms of that change. It's very easy if you're part of a project that's gotten out to like 1.5, 2 years. It's a very large scale project, many phases. After 2 years, it's very, very easy to look and go, it's not very urgent anymore because it's been 2 years we've been doing this now. So having someone reaffirm the urgency and the need for the change and making it understood is really helpful in preventing change fatigue. That feeling that it's this fatigue will never end, the work is ongoing, and not seeing a light at the end of the tunnel. Measure and celebrate small and big successes along the way. So again, we touched on this earlier, but creating events, creating points of measurement throughout our journey of change. So not only being able to say, this is what will look like in the end, but how do we measure how we've progressed along the way? And those small successes can be incredibly motivating to keep us moving forward. Prepare for attrition. So change is not, it's not uncommon during times of transformational change to see turnover. And it honestly can be a mix of different things. I frequently say it's rarely people being pushed out the door, and it's more just people realizing that something is not for them. So when we're going through transformational change, sometimes someone will start in a particular role and the ultimate role that they're in just looks very different to what they do today. And so people leave. Other times people will leave as a result of a lack of communication and transparency, like we talked about, information vacuums. And so there's a mix of things that can cause attrition throughout projects. But having clear, defined processes of structuring, clarity on roles, clarity on performance, clarity on processes in the event of attrition helps to prevent mass panic in terms of coverage, people having to lean in, do more than one job, and the change fatigue that comes with all of that. And then lastly, re-engage with quick wins stories and events. So again, using small wins along the way to keep motivating ourselves, using those stories. So leadership sharing stories of the kickoff. Do you all remember when we started our transformation in 2017? That kind of thing. It can really motivate people to continue through any change fatigue. In conclusion, so when major change is successful, you can certainly see it and you can feel it. The benefits are great. The ROI has been realized, but more than that, the folks who've successfully gone through that change, there's learnings and there's personal growth and there's an immense amount of pride in having been successful. Lots of hope for future projects and future transformations. I hope you found this session useful and thought-provoking as you embark on your own next change initiative. Thank you.